the superpower illusion. In the early 1960s, America walked into Vietnam with the confidence of a giant. A nation that had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan truly believed, that nothing in the world could hurt it. It had the biggest economy, the strongest military, the most advanced technology, and the moral conviction that freedom was its destiny and its duty. To Washington, Vietnam wasn't a war. It was a test, a small, distant conflict where America would prove yet again that power, discipline, and righteousness always prevailed. Politicians spoke about it like a chore, regrettable perhaps, but manageable. A few advisors, a few helicopters, a few thousand troops, just enough to keep the world safe. Behind closed doors, generals reassured presidents, we can handle anything they throw at us. We defeated Hitler. This is nothing. This will be quick. The American public believed it too. For a generation raised on victory parades and booming prosperity, war felt like something America controlled. A lever you pull, a switch you flip, a problem solved. Confidence became complacency. Complacency became blindness. But Vietnam wasn't Europe. It wasn't deserts or open fields or clear skies. It was a maze, a living, breathing labyrinth of jungle, rivers, shadows, and silence. It was a place where the U.S. military's strengths turned into weaknesses. Tanks got stuck in mud. Helicopters drew fire from unseen tree lines. Soldiers marched through a green hell that never slept, never cleared, never surrendered. And the enemy didn't care about America's past victories. They didn't line up in neat formations. They didn't fight for medals or parades. They fought for home, and for them, home wasn't a map. It was the soil under their feet, the tunnels beneath the earth, the trees that hid them like old friends. America didn't enter Vietnam with arrogance out of malice, but out of memory. The memory of being unbeatable, the memory of saving the world, the memory of wars that ended with ticker tape rain and cheering crowds. But Vietnam was not a war that could be won with memory. It was a war that demanded something America had never been forced to question before, its own invincibility. And as the first boots sank into Vietnamese mud, the illusion that America couldn't be hurt began its slow, painful unraveling. The enemy, no one saw coming. The first American patrols entered the jungle expecting enemy soldiers who looked like soldiers, uniformed, organized, visible. Instead, they stepped into a battlefield that didn't behave like a battlefield at all. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A farmer by day, a fighter by night, a woman planting rice who hid ammunition beneath the soil, a teenager who smiled at a passing patrol and then marked their path for an ambush. This wasn't an army, it was a population that had turned itself into a weapon. American troops were trained to fight battles, but Vietnam offered no battles, only moments. Moments of silence broken by sudden gunfire. Moments of calm that ended with explosions triggered by invisible hands. Moments where a path looked safe until it wasn't. The Viet Cong didn't try to defeat America's power, they tried to dissolve it, cut it into 1,000 small wounds until momentum became hesitation, and hesitation became fear. They built tunnel systems miles long, underground cities with hospitals, sleeping quarters, supply rooms, and escape shafts that opened like lungs into the jungle. You could march over a village for weeks and never meet a single fighter, but they could watch you from below, listening to every footstep. America fought above the ground, the Viet Cong fought inside it. The jungle became their camouflage. They vanished into bamboo thickets. They moved silently through elephant grass. They let the monsoon rains erase their footprints. And every time U.S. soldiers thought the area was clear, a trapdoor opened, a rifle appeared, and another life was taken. To American commanders, this enemy made no sense. They didn't fight for territory. They didn't retreat in order. They didn't break. They didn't behave. Washington called them insurgents, terrorists, bandits. But these labels were blindfolds. The truth was harder to face. The United States wasn't fighting an army. It was fighting a society that did not fear death the way a superpower feared failure. A society that believed losing battles meant nothing if the war itself never ended. A society that looked at America's strength and saw not intimidation, but target practice. And for the first time in modern history, the most powerful country on earth looked across the jungle and truly did not understand what it was up against. The jungle that fought back. Vietnam was more than a battlefield. It was a living organism, a predator, a presence that wrapped itself around every soldier and whispered, "You don't belong here." American troops quickly learned that the jungle was the first enemy they met, and the last one they escaped. It swallowed sound, it drowned radio calls, it hid movement, erased footprints, and sheltered the people who fought for it. If Europe had been a chessboard, Vietnam was a maze built by nature to confuse, exhaust, and break the mind. The heat alone was an assault. Humidity hung thick as syrup, turning uniforms into soaked rags. Soldiers drank constantly and still felt thirsty. Leeches clung to ankles, mosquitoes carried diseases, infections spread faster than bullets. The jungle punished both sides, but only one side was born inside it. Monsoon rainstorms hit like walls of water. A troop could march 1 mile and find itself knee-deep in mud, boots peeling apart, rifles rusting at the edges. Radio batteries drowned, maps turned to paste. Helicopters circled above, blind beneath clouds, unable to land in the swamp below. This was a new kind of war, one where the terrain chose the victor. The Viet Cong didn't simply hide in the jungle, they merged with it. They built traps from bamboo sharpened into knives. They dug pits lined with spikes smeared in poison. They created ambushes that vanished the moment the firefight ended. A quiet clearing could explode with mines, wires, and invisible trip lines. A single wrong step could remove a leg, a life, a future. US troops tried to fight back with machines, bulldozers, defoliants, flamethrowers, but the jungle always returned, as if growing from memory rather than soil. A leaf burned today reappeared tomorrow. A cleared path turned into a trap by night. For the first time in American history, soldiers realized something horrifying. They were not the masters of this landscape. They were intruders. Unwelcome, unmatched, unheard. The jungle didn't shoot. It didn't bleed. It didn't retreat. It simply waited, patient as death itself. And slowly, the superpower began to understand. This war wasn't fought in cities or on fields. It was fought in a green, unending labyrinth, where even victory felt like survival, and survival felt like defeat. The numbers that lied. America entered Vietnam with charts, graphs, predictions, and promises. Generals in polished offices spoke confidently of metrics, projections, measurable success. Washington demanded numbers, and they got numbers. But the numbers weren't truth. They were illusions. Body counts became the language of victory. Every briefing, every headline, every speech revolved around enemy dead. If more Viet Cong died than Americans, the war was progressing. No territory gained? Doesn't matter. No strategic objective? Irrelevant. Just show the numbers. But Vietnam didn't operate by numerical logic. What America called enemy fighters were often farmers, students, villagers, people who disappeared into civilian life until nightfall. How do you count an enemy who is also a population? How do you declare victory when every body killed creates 3 more who want revenge? Commanders inflated numbers. Officers lied to please their superiors. Entire firefights were misreported to keep promotions flowing. Paper victories masked real defeats. Battles won on charts were lost in the mud. Helicopters brought back wounded men, while headquarters received glowing reports of successful engagements. Patrols returned shaken and silent, while Washington announced that the enemy was all but finished. Every month America was told it was winning. Every month more names appeared on the black telegrams delivered to American doorsteps. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong didn't count bodies. They counted patience. Time was their strategy. Endurance was their weapon. They knew they could lose 100 fighters in a day and still move forward, because to them, the war never ended, and sacrifice was not measured in numbers but in necessity. The US military measured progress by subtraction. Their enemy measured it by survival, and survival is infinite. The numbers didn't lie because they were wrong. They lied because they were meaningless. A superpower tried to fight a war with statistics. A nation of farmers fought back with belief. And in the end, America didn't lose Vietnam because its numbers were small, but because it trusted the wrong numbers entirely. The sky that turned to fire. America believed air power could solve anything. It had ended World War II. It had destroyed entire enemy industries. It had reduced empires to ash. So when Vietnam refused to bow, Washington reached for the same weapon, the sky. Rolling Thunder began in 1965, a bombing campaign so massive that planners thought it would force Hanoi to surrender through shock alone. On paper, it was overwhelming. Hundreds of jets, tons of explosives, targets selected by men in suits, thousands of miles away, circling names on maps they'd never walk. The first airstrikes lit up the jungle like magnesium fire. Villages vanished, forests ignited, roads shattered into dust. The sky turned orange, black, and red, a palette of destruction no canvas could contain. But Vietnam was not Germany. It was not Japan. It was not a nation that could be bombed into submission. The North Vietnamese moved at night. They hid under mountains. They repaired roads before sunrise. Every crater became a hiding place. Every ruined village became a recruiting poster. America saw explosions. Vietnam saw resolve. Napalm fell from the sky like a curse, sticking to skin, burning through forests, turning rivers into liquid fire. To US commanders, it was a tool. To Vietnamese villagers, it was apocalypse with a tail number. And the more America dropped, the stronger the North seemed to become. It was as if the bombs were feeding something instead of destroying it, feeding anger, feeding endurance, feeding the belief that the United States didn't understand the land it fought on, or the people it fought against. Pilots returned to base with nothing but smoke in their rearview mirrors, unsure if they'd hit rebels or ruins. On the ground, soldiers marched under skies that glowed orange at night, lit by fires they didn't set and couldn't extinguish. The war was above and below, and neither side controlled both. Air superiority meant everything in previous wars. In Vietnam, it meant almost nothing. America could dominate the sky, but the war was in the ground, the jungles, the villages, the mines. It was the first time in U.S. history that firepower failed to break the enemy's will. Because Vietnam did not measure loss in cities or factories, it measured loss in memory, and memory does not burn. America lit the sky on fire. Vietnam kept moving in the darkness beneath it. The home front erupts. For the first years of the war, America believed its strength came from unity, but Vietnam revealed a truth no one wanted to face. A nation can have the strongest military in the world and still fall apart from within. Television changed everything. For the first time in history, war wasn't distant. It wasn't filtered by newspapers or delayed by telegrams. It was broadcast live into American living rooms. Families ate dinner while watching villages burn. Children played on the carpet while body bags were loaded onto helicopters. The illusion of glory evaporated overnight. Protests erupted across campuses. Students marched with signs that shook the foundation of patriotism. Bring them home. Hell no, we won't go. No more lies. The draft, once seen as a duty, became a symbol of injustice. Rich sons avoided it. Poor sons could not. Mothers wept as their boys' lottery numbers were called, sending them into a war no one could explain. Veterans returned home not to parades but to confusion. Some were spat on. Some were called murderers. Some were ignored entirely, a silence more painful than any insult. The nation that had united to defeat Hitler was now divided by a war half its people no longer believed in. Churches broke apart. Families argued across dinner tables. Generations stopped speaking to each other. In Washington, politicians scrambled to control the narrative. They insisted progress was being made, that victory was around the corner, even as casualty lists lengthened and cities back home shook with unrest. The war that America thought it could fight over there had seeped into its streets, into its classrooms, into its conscience. By 1968, the home front was a battlefield of its own, one without uniforms, one where every conversation was a firefight, and every headline another explosion. America was no longer fighting Vietnam, it was fighting itself. And as the protests grew louder, as coffins returned covered in flags, as trust in government dissolved, one truth became impossible to ignore. The enemy had not broken America. America was breaking itself. The heroes no one welcomed. The men who fought in Vietnam were not abstractions. They were boys from Ohio cornfields, Brooklyn apartments, Texas ranches, California suburbs. Some volunteered. Most were drafted. All were told the same thing. You're fighting for your country. You're fighting for freedom. And so they went, believing, hoping, trusting. They marched through jungles, crawled through tunnels, held dying friends in their arms, and watched villages burn under orders they didn't understand. They survived ambushes, booby traps, monsoons, diseases, and nights filled with the kind of fear that ages a soul in minutes. And when their tour was over, when they finally stepped off the plane onto American soil, they looked for the one thing every soldier expects, home. But home did not greet them. Airports were quiet, crowds looked away, strangers avoided eye contact. Some were cursed at, some were spit on, some were called killers by people who had never been within 10,000 miles of a war zone. Vietnam was the first war America didn't win, and the soldiers became the symbol of that loss. They didn't return as heroes, they returned as reminders. Reminders of a war the nation wanted to forget, reminders of mistakes politicians refused to admit, reminders of a conflict that split the country into pieces that couldn't be glued back together. Many veterans stepped off the plane with haunted eyes, wounds still bleeding beneath their uniforms. But they found no parades, no banners, no brass bands waiting at the gates. Just silence, just indifference, just a world that kept spinning without them. They hid their medals in drawers. They stopped wearing their uniforms in public. Some never told people they had served at all. Inside, the war kept burning. PTSD wasn't recognized. Flashbacks were dismissed as weakness. Nightmares were blamed on pride, not trauma. The Department of Veterans Affairs was overwhelmed, underfunded, and unprepared, so veterans self-medicated, with alcohol, with drugs, with silence. Marriages collapsed, families fractured. Entire communities disappeared behind closed doors. The tragedy was not only that they suffered, the tragedy was that they suffered alone. They stepped onto airplanes as soldiers, but stepped off into a country unwilling to see them. Vietnam wounded America, but America wounded them back. And for many, that second wound never healed. The government that lost its voice. In the beginning, America trusted its government, trusted its leaders, trusted that those with stars on their shoulders and seals on their podiums would tell the truth. Vietnam shattered that trust. The gap between what was happening in the jungle and what was being said in Washington became an abyss. Presidents promised progress. Generals reported momentum. Press releases spoke of victory being within reach. But behind the closed doors of the Pentagon, a different truth was being whispered. We cannot win this war. By the mid-1960s, government reports were a choreography of deception. Press conferences carefully avoided key details. Casualty numbers were massaged. Failed operations were listed as partial successes. Entire villages erased by airstrikes never made it into official records. Then came the leak that changed everything. The Pentagon Papers. Thousands of classified documents smuggled out by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Marine, a patriot, a man who could no longer bear the weight of a silenced truth. Published in 1971, they revealed decades of lies, contradictions, and hidden agendas. It wasn't just that the war was going badly. It was that 4 presidents in a row had known it and continued anyway. The American people felt exposed, humiliated, betrayed. The government, once the center of national unity, became a symbol of corruption. Television screens showed senators interrogating generals, protesters filling the streets, and a president speaking to a nation that had stopped believing him. The credibility crisis didn't end with the war, it outlived it. Distrust seeped into everything: elections, institutions, foreign policy, even the presidency itself. Vietnam didn't just break America's confidence, it broke America's faith. It taught a generation that leaders could lie, that patriotism could be manipulated, that war could be waged not for victory, but for politics. And when a government loses its voice, its people stop listening. The cracks revealed by Vietnam didn't close. They widened, they deepened, they shaped the decades that followed. And in many ways, the America that walked into Vietnam died long before the last helicopter lifted off from Saigon. The withdrawal that felt like defeat. By the early 1970s, America no longer spoke of victory. It spoke of peace with honor, a phrase crafted in offices far from the jungle, meant to disguise the truth. The war was being abandoned. Soldiers still fought, still patrolled, still bled. But behind them, the political ground had shifted. Congress cut funding. The draft evaporated. Public opinion collapsed. The will to fight drained away faster than the helicopters could lift off. Vietnamization became the new strategy, handing the war over to South Vietnamese forces. But everyone knew it was a bridge built on paper. The South was exhausted, its leadership corrupt, its armies stretched thin, its people drained by years of bloodshed. No amount of American training could fill the crater where national unity should have been. In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords. Troops came home, flags waved, politicians delivered speeches about closure. But closure never came. Because the war didn't end, America simply stepped away from it. 2 years later, North Vietnamese divisions surged south with a force that no one could deny anymore. City after city fell. Defensive lines collapsed. And on April 29, 1975, the world watched a moment that became the symbol of the entire conflict. Helicopters evacuating the final Americans from Saigon's rooftop. Footage showed desperate civilians climbing the stairs, hands reaching for the skids, children lifted above the crowd in a last plea for escape. Marines pushed people back as the rotor wash whipped dust into the air. It didn't look like a withdrawal. It looked like a rescue from a war that America no longer had the strength or the willingness to continue. The last helicopter lifted off at 7:53 a.m. It carried Marines who had spent the night destroying radios, burning documents, and listening for explosions that never came. As they left, they looked down at a city drowning in fear, a city America had promised to defend. Saigon fell the next day. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace. The flag changed. The war ended. But for America, it didn't end. It hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. Vietnam was the first war the United States left, not with victory, not with compromise, but with absence. A superpower walked away. And that absence felt like defeat, the country that never fully healed. When the last helicopter left Saigon, the war didn't stay behind. It came home, packed inside the minds of men and women who had seen things no country was prepared to help them carry. PTSD wasn't a term yet, but its symptoms were everywhere, in sleepless nights, in sudden rage, in quiet tears at kitchen tables, in the way some veterans sat with their backs against walls in restaurants, scanning every doorway. Families didn't know what to say. Friends didn't know how to listen. A nation that had spent years arguing about the war now tried to pretend it had never happened, but the scars found their way into everything. Politics hardened, trust dissolved, a generation stopped believing in institutions. The innocence of the 1950s, that unshakable faith in government, in presidents, in national purpose, evaporated. Vietnam changed the architecture of American identity. It created a country where every war would be questioned, every motive doubted, every leader scrutinized. It birthed a skepticism that still shapes American foreign policy. It created a gulf between those who served and those who didn't, a gulf that decades later still echoes in debates about patriotism, duty, and sacrifice. Even decades later, the war lived on in memorial walls covered with 58,000 names, in veterans sitting quietly at reunions wearing the same faded jackets, in families who kept unopened letters from sons who never returned. America rebuilt. America moved forward. But America did not heal. Healing requires closure. Vietnam offered none. Healing requires answers. Vietnam left only questions. Healing requires unity. Vietnam left fractures that still run through the nation's political and cultural heart. The war ended in 1975, but its shadow never left. Every veteran who wakes from a nightmare, every family that wonders who their son or father might have become, every leader who hesitates before sending troops abroad, all carry a piece of Vietnam's legacy. America didn't break in Vietnam because it was weak. It broke because it was unprepared to fight a war it didn't understand, for reasons it couldn't clearly explain, against an enemy it never fully saw, and some wounds once opened never close.